So this morning we're talking about we've started this little mini-series on the Ten Commandments, and this morning I want to talk with you, obviously from the text, I want to think with you a little bit about this idea of coveting. What does that really mean? And just a kind of a crash course in the Ten Commandments. But I'm going to start off real quick with a little story that I may have told, but it's one of my favorite little Hoja stories, and it seems pertinent to this. You know, Hoja, the great wise fool of the Middle East from the 15th century, comes actually out of the Sufist tradition. And he's this foolish sort of, lives his life in a foolish sort of way that always illuminates a kind of wisdom in retrospect. Or if you sit with it for a minute, suddenly this insight comes to mind. But that's the challenge, is to sit with the silliness and the strange, the paradoxical nature of these stories. So Hoja was in his bed, and it's late at night, and he's sound asleep, when all of a sudden these two thieves break into his house. And they start taking stuff, and he wakes up, but he doesn't jump up or anything. He just opens his eyes and sees them rummaging about his room and grabbing up stuff as much as they can throw in their bags and on their backs. And then they crawl out through the window, and then they jump on their horses and they start riding off. Well, Hoja jumps to the window and notices them riding off into the dark. And so he quickly jumps out the window, runs to his little stable, and grabs up his little beat-up old horse and gets on its back and rides as fast as he can. And he's following them. Well, the thieves have ridden for an hour or so, and they look behind him, and they see Hoja catching up. And they're surprised. What's he doing chasing us? He can't stop us. There's two of us and one of him. They ride a little bit faster, but he continues. He persists. And it looks like he's not going to give up well into the day, until finally the thieves stop. And they look at him a little defiant, a little arrogantly, and said, "What are you doing?" And Hoja smiled at him and said, "You took everything I have, so I figure I'll come live with you." I'm still trying to figure out just what that means, but I do like the paradox of it. So we're looking at this series of the Ten Commandments, and so I want to ask you to start off with, because I thought it might be fun, is for you to think about, and maybe if you want to shout it out, what's your favorite commandment? Yeah, really? You don't have a favorite commandment? If I ask your favorite Bible verse, you might say, Jesus, love your neighbor as yourself. But what's your favorite commandment? Mine is, don't boil a goat in its mother's milk. You didn't know that's one of the commandments? You didn't know that? Oh, you think the Ten Commandments are the ones that say, don't steal, don't commit adultery, have no other gods before me. You think those are the Ten Commandments. No, these are the Ten Commandments. Seriously, these are the Ten Commandments. Make no covenant with the Canaanite tribes. Destroy their altars. Make no idols. Observe the feast of unleavened bread. The first offspring of every womb, it belongs to me. Rest on the seventh day. Celebrate the Feast of Weeks. No leavened bread during Passover. Bring the first fruits of the soil to the Lord, and you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Which is really weird. But those are the Ten Commandments. Those are actually the commandments that ended up in the Ark of the Covenant. Those are the commandments you actually find in Exodus 34. Those are the ones that actually said, when we read the text, it says, God commanded Moses to go back up in the mountains and to write down again the commandments that got destroyed. So if you go way back, right, to the earlier chapter, to our chapter here in 20, you find out the story that Cecil B. DeMille made famous, of course. And who was that guy? Charlton Heston, yes, yeah, no better Moses than him. And that's what made famous, right? We're familiar with those Ten Commandments. But what happened to those Ten Commandments? Don't you remember? Those Ten Commandments, Moses goes up. They've been out in the wilderness for 40 years, and they're miserable, and they're complaining, and the Israelites are saying, we'd rather be back in Egypt, because that was, at least we had 3 meals a day, even if we were slaves. But out here, we don't know what we're doing out here, and we're following you. We don't know. And so Moses goes up into the mountain and starts talking to God, and God inscribes these Ten Commandments. Now, if you watch the Mel Brooks version, there were actually 3 tablets, and then he drops one at the end, so we end up with, anyway, okay. History of the world, come on, how many? Yes, All right, go check it out. Anyway, he comes down with the 10, but what are they doing? Well, he's been up there for 40 days and 40 nights, right? There's always these formulaic numbers that are so important. He's up there for 40 days and 40 nights, and he comes back down, and he's got these 2 tablets inscribed, and what are the people doing? Do you remember the story? They're worshiping a calf. Hence the phrase that we use to this day, golden calves. You know, we have these golden calves that are like idols for us. They're worshiping golden calf. Actually, technically, golden calf, some would argue, a lot of scholars would argue that the calf and the bull were images for God. They were actually images for God's divinity. But they were also images for other gods and deities throughout Mesopotamia. So it's not real clear which tradition or which influence this was, but at any rate, it made Moses angry. So what did he do with the 2 tablets? He smashed them, right? Did you see the movie? Did you? You need to go back and watch it. He gets really mad at him. He smashes them, right? But then what it doesn't show in the movie, I don't think it shows in the movie, but then not too long after that, what Moses does is he gets with the sons of Levi and he says, okay, you guys are spared, but I want all of you to go kill everybody else. And that's what happens. They end up killing everybody. It's a slaughter. And you're going like, wait a minute, what story is he talking about? But you see, the 10 Commandments were not simply ethical guidelines. They were as much then ethical guidelines, they were as much also defining terms of who defines us as opposed to you. And so these practices define us against you or the other. In a sense, there was a lot of ethnic cleansing going on back in those days. If you read the book of Judges, you get one after the other, right? Back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And it's not so much stories about how God comes in and saves the day. It's more stories about how God keeps trying to tell people it's not about this, but then they go back to being people and they destroy each other, one after another. And here God tries to continue to remind it's about everyone, not about I'm going to protect you as opposed to them. So we don't have these 10 Commandments. The ones that actually get rewritten are the ones that I read to you, and those are the ones that actually end up in the Ark of the Covenant that gets carried around. So how did we end up with these 10 Commandments? Well, of course, they're in the Bible. They're in the Bible, but it's also, the Bible's made up of 4 primary editors or writers, the Old Testament, I mean, and the Torah in particular. So you have the Elohist and the Yahwist and the, now I'm forgetting the other 2. Sharm, do you remember the other 2? Sharm's our resident biblical scholar. Okay. P and Q. Pentateuch and the Q. I would say the word. Don't look at me with letters and go C. Lots of different editors and redactors. We know this, that there's a lot of different writers who composed the Pentateuch and who created these various documents we have. And so the 10 Commandments that we have were probably added at a later date, which define a wonderful ethical moral code. And hence then, so I ask you, what is your favorite commandment? And you tell me which is your favorite commandment, right? Which one? Of those that we know best. That's going to be your favorite one from now on, isn't it? Because that's when you figure you can practice pretty easily. Yeah. Rest on Sabbath. That's a good one. That's a good one. Keep the Sabbath holy. So we're going to talk today about coveting a little bit. But to get us there, to get to one of my favorite commandments, I want to, first I'll give you a tiny bit of just critical history. The 10 Commandments that we have, that we think of as the 10 Commandments, they're both there. You can go to chapter 34 and see those 10 Commandments as well. But the ones that we have that we consider the 10 Commandments that ended up coming down throughout the generations as the ones that we sort of celebrate as Judeo-Christians, or rooted in our Judeo-Christian past. Those have been around for some time, but now I forgot what I was going to say. Okay, I've totally digressed and missed my point here. So I'm going to jump back. So the curious thing about these commandments is that when we find them in this fashion, what happens to them? What happens to the 10 Commandments that we have? What do you think of when we think of the 10 Commandments now in terms of public information or public opinion? What do we think of this of the social political struggles over whether or not they should be published or put in public settings, right? Have you been to the Capitol? We have them at our Capitol, right? Have you seen them on our Capitol grounds? We have them. Arkansas went through this battle a few years ago. They're there. It's interesting to me that most of the folks who really get behind it, sort of like a lot of folks that get behind a lot of things, don't really know the content of everything they're standing behind, right? They don't know all the details. Ask anybody, what are the 10 Commandments? They might remember 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. They wouldn't remember probably all 10. And probably, if they're lucky, half of them. They might could name all of the team players on the Dallas Cowboys. They might could name some of their favorite lyrics to favorite songs, but the 10 Commandments. So what is it about these things that grab our fervor? I think it has to do a little bit with this idea of coveting, this idea of looking for something. And so we cling to stuff. We cling to things because we have this longing, this coveting. But in reality, it's sort of a projection of what I've often termed as sort of our social addiction, our inability to look at a deeper side of who we are. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the other side of coveting. One of my favorite songs that I grew up listening to with my kids grew up listening to. Brad still sings this song with his kids. And the band's going to help me. I dropped this song on them this morning. It's a wonderful song by Trout Fishing in America. And it sort of encapsulates what I think lies behind this whole old idea of coveting. We ready? All right, here we go. It belongs to me. I've had it for a long time. There's nothing like it in this world. It's mine. I know you want it, and I really can't blame you. You'd like to touch it, but if you do, I'll maim you. So if you value your life, you value your face, you'll accept this at face value. It's mine, I won't share it, it's mine. I feel the envy in your eyes each time you see it. Think of what you want to, but you know that it's rightfully mine. You'd better believe it. And when I'm gone and you're alone, don't you even try it. 'Cause I know, yes, you know that I'll know, and you could never deny it. So if you value your life, you value your face, you'll accept this at face value. It's mine, I won't share it, it's mine. I saw it first, it's mine. I had it last, it's mine. Oh, can't you see, it's made for me. It's mine, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Mine, mine, mine. It's a treasure, uniquely one of a kind. Any king would be proud to possess. It's mine. It's my pleasure, my comfort, my joy. It's the love of my life. On an island, alone by myself in a sea of desire. So if you value your life, you value your face, you'll accept this at face value. It's mine, don't share it, it's mine. mine. So, yeah, my object, my longing, my ego, my belief system, my creed, my island in the midst of a sea of desire. It sort of describes the human condition. This idea of coveting things is really sort of our human nature more than it is God's prohibition. It's simply kind of how we exist in this reality around us. And the challenge for us, I think, as people of faith, as well as people who live in community, who live in the context of one another, is this idea of how do we begin to see ourselves as a part of one another as opposed to as existing apart from one another, where we're a part of one another, we're a part in community. Sharm and I don't see Tolbert in here this morning. Tolbert was not here this morning. Tolbert was with us, and Tolbert comes to 11:11 some, and he actually said last night he was going to go maybe to Palo Pinto for a star festival. So, looking at the stars at night. So I suspect he's waking up early, having looked at the amazing stars last night. But Sharm and I were there with several others and a number of others from the church, and we were at Habitat for Humanity, building a house. And it was interesting because I didn't know the directors of this local project. We were building a house over on the southeast side. And I forget Wayne's last name, but Wayne is a man that I actually knew back at Trinity United Methodist Church years and years and years ago, 35 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. And Wayne came up to me and immediately said, hi, and I'm looking at him and thinking, I do know you, and he reminds me who he is in the context. And we sort of hit kind of had an old home week as we were remembering old stories and such, and where he's been since then. But he said, since I've been with you, since we were at Trinity, and then we moved to Arlington Heights Methodist, and then we've ended up at Arborlawn Methodist, where we are now for the last decade or so. He said, in all of that time, I got involved in Habitat way back. It just was an accident the first time I joined some friends from the church and we started building. He said, ever since then, I've been involved in these projects every time I can. He said, I've built 87 houses in the time that I've been involved. And if you knew him, he's probably in his late 70s. He could even be in his 80s. But if you just watched him running around, it occurred to me, because I got to be up on the roof. Actually, I got to be up on the roof by a total accident. I simply looked up and I said, Wayne, it looks like the metal sheeting there that drainage part's going to need some tape over it so that it covers it up so that it doesn't seep behind the little metal flaps. And he says, that's a good idea, Tom. And then he shows up with a harness and a ladder, and I spent the rest of the afternoon up on the roof where the sun was shining and helping to put up siding, which was a great learning experience for me. But the other fun thing about it, because I was the only guy on the roof out of this group, the fun thing about it was I got to watch everyone down below and work feverishly and back and forth and trading. And Wayne says, the way it works here is that there's only 4 or 5 ladders, but there might be 8 people who need a ladder. So depending on what's going on, your ladder may disappear. And then you just have to find someone else. But we don't hold it against anybody. We're all here to get something done together. So it's all share and share alike, And sure enough, as I'm looking at the ladder, and I'm thankful to have my little tether there, my tall ladder just disappears. I don't even see who takes it. It just walks off. And then one shows up later on in the day. And of course, eventually shows up for me to get down. But it was so much fun to be up high watching. And I saw what Wayne was doing as he was moving about the crowd, and it occurred to me that while we're building a house, and the woman and her daughter who will be moving there also were participating in building the house. Habitat's an amazing organization, an amazing idea, and people participate in building their own homes as well as in paying for their homes, but without interest rates and without some of the other things. It's made much more easy and affordable for people to buy a house. They've provided something like 8-point-something million homes in the past 40 years that it's been in existence. It's quite a phenomenal project. With Carter's involvement, too, has helped. But watching Wayne down there below, I realized that as much as it is about building a house, it's really about building community. It's really about the experience of working on something together. And it occurred to me that at that level, at that place, Nobody was concerned about what anybody had. They were concerned about what they could give in participating. It was as if, yeah, we're losing 8 hours today. A couple of football games I'm missing. It's hot out here. But there was this sense of joy. We don't even know each other. There was this sense of joy in participating in community that is devoid of this need to have or this need to be anything other than present with one another. And maybe that's the real gift here with this idea of community, of coveting. Not so much of the don't do this. And I admit, it's hard not to see it that way. But if you put it in its historical context, you realize it's a part of a tribal reality that sadly we still struggle with today. That sadly, because we're human and we get fearful of things, we still find ourselves allying with certain groups against other groups because of who we are or because of what we've refused to take a deeper look at in ourselves. And so we find ourselves looking for alliances. And how do we define our alliances? We can define them by what we believe. We can define them by how we act. We can define them by our practices. But what's the real issue there is that we're defining ourselves as opposed to someone else. I don't think these commands as such, in my mind, are about do's and don'ts. And I caution against someone saying to me, well, you're saying these commandments may be more like suggestions then, which is what liberal theology gets accused of a lot. But the truth about liberal theology is that liberal theology approaches everything with an open mind and a question, not with an avoidance or an excuse. It's not saying these are suggestions. It's saying, look at what's behind all this. Look at the human condition. Look at our human nature and our need to protect our egos or our sense in which we have to have something to be something. When in reality, these things are simply saying to want what is not you, to want what we don't already have or what already we exist in the midst of, is dysfunctional. It's harmful. It's destructive. It's unhealthy. But to want to be present to who we are and where we are and what we have is the beginning of the kingdom of God, is the beginning of a healthy relationship with community. To be present as opposed to finding that island and start stockpiling our egos. One of my favorite songs is this. Y'all are still there. That's great. One of my favorite songs is this wonderful song by Elton John. And it's this song called Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Y'all remember that song from the 70s? It's a great song. What's the guy's name who actually wrote it? Rupert? Bernie Taupin. I knew it was Bernie. Yeah, it sounds like Rupert. Bernie Taupin wrote this, actually has written most of Elton John's songs, and in an interview when they were asking him about what it was, why he wrote this song, it's interesting because he says that was a time in my life when I struggled with a lot of things, but I don't really remember why I wrote it. But now as I listen to it being sung all the time, it resonates with something deep down inside me, and it makes me feel this sense of peace. Elton John, when he was interviewed, said the song for him was about all those ideals that we set for ourselves, about all of those longings like Dorothy and the Scarecrow and the Tin Man, all heading for Oz, all looking for something. But when they look, what they find is what they were looking for, what they had all along, right? It was always with them. But somehow making that journey seems important. And Elton John said for him it was about remembering who he was and what he was about, and more what he had to give than what he had to build. And when he could start letting go of what he felt like he had to build around him, it allowed him to be more freely present to who he really was in the community. I think it's a lot of what we think about when we think about God's grace as Wesleyans, as Methodists, that God's grace is already with us, that we already live in the midst of God's grace, of God's being. We are already there. There's nothing we do to get that sense of acceptance. But the challenge is for us to learn to let go of that, to learn to open up, to learn to live more wholeheartedly present to one another. And in doing so, we find ourselves already where we'd always wanted to be. I'll close with this little parable before the band shares a great song with us. There was an old man who lived outside the edge of this village. A younger man had made it his livelihood to find obscure, rare items. The rarer, the more interested he was in it. And so he traveled around the world looking for these beautiful gems, these beautiful objects, these rare items. And the more he could find, the more it gave him this sense of deep joy, like he had all of these amazing things. And it gave him a real sense of joy, but the other side of that was it also perpetuated this sense in which he had to keep looking for stuff. And he heard about this old man that lived at the edge of the village who had a prized ruby, an amazing, beautiful ruby. And so he went to the edge of the village and he saw it and immediately knew he had to have it. He offered everything. This old man sat there with his ruby and showed it to him and said, "You know, are you sure, really? You really want this?" And the man said, "I'll do whatever it takes. I want that ruby. It's beautiful. It's amazing." And so the old man said, "Well, fine. It's yours." And he handed it over to the younger guy. The young man immediately took it and he went back to his place amongst all of his other stuff. And he sat there for a day staring at this beautiful ruby, at how much it had satisfied him, this beautiful reflective quality. But the longer he looked at it, something began to bother him in the back of his mind. He couldn't let go of it. Something pursued him. And so he took the ruby the next day back to the old man. And the old man said, "Why are you back here? I gave you the ruby." And the young man said, "I know." He said, "I want you to have it back." And the old man said, "No, no, no. Why would you do that? It's no longer mine. It's yours. I gave it to you." The young man says, "I know you did." He said, "What I really want is I want whatever you had that allowed you to give that to me so freely."